If you were here yesterday, maybe you're having a little bit of deja vu. But full disclosure, you'd expect that if I was speaking about being a child of God, that you might be seeing a few baby photos this morning, a little bit of a slideshow. You're going to be disappointed. You can come up to me afterwards if you want to see some photos. Let's put our disappointment aside and grab maybe one of the Bibles in front of you or a Bible on your phone that you brought. We're going to read the passage for today. It's from 1 John. 1 John at the end of chapter 2, verse 28, going to 3:10. We're probably on page 1208 if you picked one of the Bibles in front of you. 1 John 2:28 to 3:10. And now, dear children, continue in him, so that when he appears, we may be confident and unashamed before him at his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone who does what is right has been born of him. How great is the love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself, just as he is pure. Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. But you know that he appeared so that he might take away our sins. And in him is no sin. No one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him. Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. He who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. He who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. No one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in him. He cannot go on sinning, because he has been born of God. This is how we know who the children of God are, and who the children of the devil are. Anyone who does not do what is right is not a child of God, nor is anyone who does not love his brother or sister. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. I wonder how many times in your life you've heard that verse, and how many times have you read it in a devotional, seen it pasted over a picture of a rainbow or a meadow in some social media, inspirational post. And when we are moving through the book of 1 John, we come to that verse, and perhaps you glaze over it a little bit because you've heard it a million times. But if you had never read it before, how would it strike you? If someone who didn't know what it meant asked you what it means, how would you explain what it means to be a child of God? It's actually a sort of an odd thing to say. It's perhaps a little lofty, kind of warm, fuzzy, maybe even a little pretentious to claim to be a child of God. So we're going to ask ourselves, what does it mean that we are God's children? We're going to unpack that a little bit. 3 things that I suggest. What does it mean to be God's children? Well, number 1, it tells us about the kind of love that God has for us. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. It's the kind of love that a parent has for a child. I'm a new parent myself. They say when you become a father and mother for the first time, you can tap into something deep, some aspect of God's love. Maybe this is true. Maybe I'm beginning to understand this love in a new way. I think that's probably a process, not a one-time moment kind of thing. But a parental love is one that's protective. It's unconditional. It's powerful. It's warm. It's committed. And it's certainly sacrificial. A parent delights in their child, especially when the child itself is a happy child and a sleeping child or a playing child or growing or learning something new. When the child feels joy, the parent does too. It's like it passes between them. Now, my daughter Adeline just learned how to roll this week, and she starts slow. I can't tell how intentional it is, but all of a sudden she hits that point of no return and she's gone. Spread eagle on her back. And it's a joyful thing to watch. And she has now learned to kind of sit up in this little chair and kind of reach for things and pull them to her mouth. And that is a really special, joyful thing. It makes her happy. It makes me happy. You know, we feel that joy when she grows, when she smiles and just enjoys love. And I mean, even if she's not happy, we want to lavish that love on her, like it says in 1 John, right? And when John says that God has lavished love on us, he means that the kind of love is a parental one in many ways. It's like a father, like a mother. That's the first thing that it tells us, the kind of love that God has for us. I mean, it also tells us our identity in Christ. It's right after John calls us children of God, he says, well, that's what we are. Dear friends, he says in verse 2, we are children of God. When God calls us his children, it's not just a label that he attaches to us for a moment. It's a new identity. Like when a child is adopted, they're not just called son or daughter of so-and-so. Well, they really are their son and daughter. There's a change. You know, they weren't before, and they are now. And John says in verse 9, you can look it up, that we're actually born of God, that God's life is in us. And what does this mean? This is a mysterious process as I think we'll ever come to know. Jesus describes it something like the wind. It moves wherever it pleases. We hear it, but we don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. A transformation takes place. We're adopted into God's family. Maybe for you it's subtle. Maybe for someone else this is a dramatic change when we accept the invitation to join God's family. He's a good, good Father. It's who he is. And we're loved by him. It's who we are. The third thing that it means to be a child of God, not only does it describe the kind of love God has for us or our identity, but I think it describes the kind of life that we're called to lead. To be a child of God is different than being a child of, Joe or Frank or Mary, or, being a child of God is a very particular familial relation. I think it comes with a responsibility. Not a burdensome one or an overwhelming one, but a privilege maybe to imitate God, to live a godly life, to realize our calling as image of God, which I see as sort of mini representations of God that walk around the world, caring, loving, healing, creating. As the saying goes, like father, like son, or like daughter. It's a life that we're called to lead. And John describes that in verse 9 and 10. He says, they, children of God, cannot go on sinning because they've been born of God. This is how we know who the children of God are and who are the children of the devil. Anyone who does not do what is right is not God's child, nor is anyone who does not love their brother and sister. I actually find these words pretty intimidating. It sounds like John is saying, if you sin, you're not a child, you're out. It does feel like that. And probably we're thinking, well, that disqualifies me this morning or something like that. But I actually don't think that's what John is saying. He says, the word is go on sinning. There's like an emphasis on the continuation here. People who make a practice of sinning, who sin as a way of life, and these are the ones who show themselves not to be born of God. Like that's the point that John's making. And I hear you, this is actually still intimidating. But I do want us to note that the emphasis is on sin as a lifestyle, as a practice, as a way of being. It's not about individual actions that disqualify you, X or Y, here or there. You're not disqualified from God's family by a bad thing that you do. You're not disqualified by many bad things that you do. I think there's a dangerous line of thinking when we read this, and we can kind of draw a line and we say, well, we must be on this side of the line, and those people are on that side of the line because they live like that. And I don't think that deals well with the complexities of life, especially, trauma, addiction, habitual sin. I think these are more complicated than John is acknowledging here. John's not trying to address these things, but he is trying to say that there's a connection between being a child of God, becoming a child of God, and the life of righteousness, which is really right relationships that flows naturally out of that identity, albeit halteringly, gradually out of that identity. N.T. Wright describes what this is like. He describes the movement from becoming a child of God and the new life that we live. He says, we're playing a different kind of music. And even if our fingers slip sometimes, we play some wrong notes that belong to the music we used to play, that doesn't mean we're going back to play that old music for real once more. When we become a child of God, we start playing a new kind of music. Children of God, it's what we're called, it's who we are, and it's what we do. Reading texts like this are still confusing, no matter how much explanation we give them. It sounds deceptively simple, right? And I think the complex truths that John is communicating actually lie a little bit under the surface. When we read John and he says, well, there's children of God and there's children of the devil. And if you know God, then you do good, you love people, you don't sin. If you don't know God, you don't do good, and you're a child of the devil. And it's actually pretty off-putting. It's pretty off-putting. And because we know that the lines that separate people are not that crisp or defined. We know that the lines that separate people are a little blurry, and actually they shift. It begs the question, are there really just two kinds of people? Are there really just good and bad, children of God and children of the devil? I want to clarify this because I think it's really important. The letter of 1 John, it's a certain kind of literature. It has a certain kind of context, background, and sort of stylistic influence to it. It's written to a largely Gentile audience, and as such, it has to communicate in a way that fits their worldview, that fits the way they understand, or at least how they talk. No, this would have been a Greek worldview, and there's kind of two features of a Greek worldview which we see in 1 John and which kind of act as barriers for us to understand it. There's this idealism. It's full of big ideas, love, light, life. That's how Greeks talk. And it's full of dualism. There's black and there's white. There's good and there's evil. There's God and the devil. So I'm suggesting here that John, who's a Jewish man, well acquainted with the complexities and moral nuances of life, I think he's writing in a certain way so that he's understood by a certain audience. The idealism and the dualism in this text, it's more a literary feature than a description of a reality. At least that's what I'm putting forth for you to consider. I don't think John is trying to say there's just two kinds of people. He might not use this kind of language, but I think he would acknowledge, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of faith. There's a spectrum of childlikeness. There's a spectrum of morality, and there's this slow shaping of our character through the many ups and downs of life. Sometimes we live as a child of God, and sometimes we don't. There's a philosopher who spent some time in a Soviet prison camp, and he sums this up well. His name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He says, "The line separating good and evil, it passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained." This is spoken by someone who, again, spent time in prison camps. In other words, we're all a little bit of a mix, aren't we? We're all on a journey where some of us are going this way, some going that way, some at different speeds, and none of us is simple. We'd be at fault to assume that anyone in this room is any less complex than we are. And probably in this room, we're actually somewhere all between the rich young ruler who thinks he's got it all figured out. He's followed all the commandments. And when Jesus tells him to give it all away, he walks away. Or maybe we're between that character and between Zacchaeus, who's led a life of corruption and betrayal, but when Jesus invites himself over to his house, he does decide to lead a life of generosity. Perhaps we're all between these two complex people on a given day. So I want to ask one more time, what does it mean to be a child of God, given all these complexities? We're actually missing a lot if all we do is just read these few verses. This letter is not written in a vacuum. I mean, nothing in the New Testament is written in a vacuum. It's actually continuing in this tradition from the Hebrew Bible, where it uses children of God imagery. And so it's riffing off a theme in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is a story in search of an ending. And this provides a glimpse at the ending. This children of God idea comes from the Old Testament. It doesn't just explain where the idea comes from, but it's going to actually explain what enables this children of God thing to be true in the first place. So I'm just going to point out two places in the Old Testament that are going to help flesh out this idea for us. And it's, number one, it's the clash that we read about in Genesis 3 between Eve and the serpent, and Eve's offspring and the serpent's offspring. You know, there's this moment where the first people, they decide to trust the deceiver, and as a result, God makes a promise to them, in particular to the snake. He says, I, God, will set hostility between you, the snake, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. Her offspring will strike you on the head, and you will strike him on the heel. It describes sort of a mutual conflict where Eve has descendants that will one day defeat the snake, but only after first being bitten by the snake, in this kind of a sacrificial, a substitutionary, sort of atoning death. Like, that's the picture. And this is the main plot conflict in the Bible. Eve's descendants, the serpent's descendants or influence in the way. From then on in the Bible, we're kind of primed to look for descendants. And that's what we see, descendants, descendants, descendants. And we're primed to look at how are these descendants in conflict with the serpent in some way? How are they choosing to define good and evil by themselves? How are they choosing not to trust their creator? How are they choosing to believe the lies of the deceiver? And they fail as children of God, generation after generation. And it's only when Jesus arrives, God comes himself as child, that he fulfills the calling of being an image bearer. That's the calling of every generation. They all fail. To be a human, to be a child of God. And Jesus comes, he fulfills this. He's the first one to do this. He defeats evil. He crushes the snake, but he gets bitten by the snake at the same time. It's a self-sacrificial death. He rises again. He enables the new humanity to be formed in us. It's a rebirth by the Holy Spirit so that we can now live out our calling to be image bearers, which every generation failed to do. That we can now be children of God. I think the image of God and children of God are kind of overlapping phrases here. And when John writes this about children of God, children of the devil, he is referring back to this original plot conflict in Genesis. And that's what he means in verse 8 when he says that the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. He's playing off this story that starts from the very beginning. And that's one of these things that I think helps us to understand how we become children of God and where this language comes from. The second part of the Old Testament that John is riffing off of is the idea that Israel, the nation of Israel, was called God's children. Part of God's plan to rescue humanity, to redeem creation, bring Eden back to earth, well, it hinges on the creation of a family. We know the names Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He creates a family. He creates a new set of descendants, and he eventually calls this nation to be a kingdom of priests so that they would bless the world. And what does he call them? You're my children. I'm your father. He doesn't just call them Israel's children, Abraham's children. They're God's children. They fail too. They don't live up to be the kingdom of priests or the children of God. When Jesus comes, he's a member of this ethnic family. He starts his ministry, and one of his key missions, he widens it up. He says, there used to be a smaller family, and I'm going to break open the doors, and I'm going to extend the blessing to all people. All people can be part of the family. All people can be part of the children of God. He calls the sinner. He calls the sick. He calls the Gentiles. He says, join the family. Be born again. Enter in. And he gives outcasts a new purpose and identity. So we have these two stories. We have the serpent-crushing image of God, and we have the blessing-bringing family of God. And I think John weaves these two patterns, these two themes together, and he sets the stage for us so that when we get to this letter, we understand what John says when he says that the Father has lavished such love on us that we too should be called children of God. I've got a final question for us. We know all too well that our faith experience is a journey. It's a long obedience in the same direction, Eugene Peterson calls it. And on that journey, through the ups and downs, our spirits are formed by the practices that we choose to cultivate. How do we actually become more like God's children? It may be our identity, but how do we live into that identity more? John answers these questions in our passage, if you look closely. We live into our identity as God's children when we, number one, turn our eyes upon Jesus. In verse 2 in chapter 3, right there, he says, but we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. This verse, it kind of talks about the future hope that one day we'll see Jesus face to face. We don't know what that'll be like. We know, however, that it will change us. And the primary way that it will change us is that we will be more like him. Still like ourselves, but somehow different. You can think of the resurrected Jesus when he appears. He's the first glimpse of the new humanity. He's himself, but he's different. Our journey to become more like him, it starts now and it continues forever. And when John says, we'll see him one day and we'll become like him, there's a principle at work here. I think he's exposing this principle, and it's that what we are exposed to shapes and determines who we become. What we are exposed to in our life shapes and determines who we become. We become what we behold. Eyes are the window to the soul. They go two ways, don't they? When we see Christ in this kind of horizon expanding eternal glory, it's going to change us to become more like him. But along the way, whatever else we see also has the power to change us as well. We know this to be true. We've seen it ourselves. When we abide in Jesus, when we meditate on his word, we spend time with him in prayer, it does change us. It's not always an easy and straightforward process, but there is a change that takes place when we abide with him. Here's a real life example. There's a study that came out recently that showed there's an alarming spike in the number of teen girls that are going to doctors and they're reporting that they've developed facial tics, some kind of activity of the face. And the cause of this is unclear, and it would be simplistic to kind of say it only comes from one thing, but there was at least one study done, and it made a connection between a lot of these girls that have developed facial tics and a certain celebrity on social media, on TikTok, that has Tourette syndrome, which is a facial tic. I'm not drawing a direct correlation causation here, but one study at least found a connection. And these videos of particular people with Tourette syndrome have 6 billion views. There's a lot of people watching this. In particular, there's a lot of teen girls watching this. And it does seem possible that extended exposure to someone with a facial tic might lead to a facial tic yourself, or at least an increase in sort of a mirror behavior. We know that what we're exposed to shapes who we become. This is just a small example, and don't exactly quote me on that, but there was at least one study. Of course, it makes me think of my daughter, Adeline. She started to smile about a month ago, and Yeah, I know those first smiles are likely because she's got some gas. I know that. But, there does seem to come a point where they try to copy your facial expressions, whether you're sticking your tongue out or you're smiling at them. And it starts with a smile from you, right? I smile. A little bit of a delay as the child processes exactly what's going on, especially if they're crying and they're trying to figure out, am I supposed to be happy right now? And then they kind of take in that joy and they can't help, but they throw it back out, right? They smile in return. It's an incredible thing to be a part of. And you can see how that might work with God as well. You can imagine God smiles at us. As a father, he smiles with joy at us. And when he does so, and we catch a glimpse of it, even if we're crying, we absorb that joy, a little bit of a delay, and then a decision, perhaps involuntary, we return that joy back. There's a mirroring that takes place. We smile back. We give the love as freely as we've received it. Perhaps over time, as we go through the journey of life, we get better at smiling back. The more we expose ourselves to God and his joy for us. N.T. Wright, he puts it this way: if we have any love for Jesus right now, our deepest longing ought to be that we would come face to face with him at last, to see his smile, to catch his facial expression, and to begin to know him in a whole new way. We're going to sing a song pretty soon. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. How do we live into our identity as God's children? We turn our eyes upon Jesus. Second way, this is straight from 1 John, that we purify ourselves through hope. And I don't exactly know what that phrase means, but it does say in verse 3 in this chapter that all who have this hope in them purify themselves, just as he, Jesus, is pure. The hope, that's the hope of seeing Jesus one day. And when this becomes our main focus, a driving motivation, it does make sense that naturally, we get ourselves ready for that. Who have a lot of us been thinking about this week and past month? We've been thinking about Nadine, whose celebration of life was yesterday. Is it fair to describe someone like her as knowing that she's getting closer and closer to seeing Jesus face to face, and thus getting ready for that? Thus kind of purifying herself through a hope? And we can live in a way so that when God smiles upon us, we can live in a way that God smiles upon. So that, we can say we fought the good fight, we've completed the race, and God can say, well done, good and faithful servant. I don't think this means kind of working harder at your own personal transformation. I don't think there's a lot of grace in that approach. Just work harder, purify yourselves, be a better person. There's a mystery here. And I think that what John says is that what drives this journey towards purification, to become more like a child, it's hope. That's what's going to drive you. It's this kind of abiding, expanding, and joyful hope. How do we live into our identity as God's children? We turn our eyes upon Jesus, we purify ourselves through hope, and we love our brother and sister. That's what the book of 1 John is all about, loving your brother and sister. 1 John takes these different themes, the love that God has for us, the love that we have for our brother and sister, and it says these are all like the same love. These are the same thing. It's one idea. To be God's child means to love his family, to love the other children. Love is not just as a feeling, but as a decision, as a commitment, and an action. How can I not just mention Nadine twice here? Did her funeral yesterday. I can't really think of a better person who exemplifies these ideas in our own church family. She purified herself through hope. She turned her eyes upon Jesus, and boy, did she love her brother and sister. How many of us We're touched by like a personal message or a note or some interaction that we had with her in the last month even. She so embraced her identity as God's child that she became more and more loving, more and more childlike, even as her life drew to a close. We were the recipients of her love. We can take that and be an inspiration, have that be an inspiration to us, become more like God's children. God smiles on us. It's time that we take this love, we absorb it, even though there's a delay, and we return that love back into God's family. I'm not just saying the people in this room. It's much broader than that. We turn that love back into God's family. We bless the nations as all of God's children are called to do. And all of God's children said, Amen. I couldn't help it.